The signal touched my console at 3:47 ship time, and for the first half-second, I assumed it was another sensor hiccup. That would have been the reasonable explanation. The endurance was old enough in the right places to be respected, and old enough in the wrong places to be temperamental. Deep patrol did that to ships. Long routes, sparse maintenance windows, endless silence pressing against the hull from every side, until even good machinery started inventing ways to remind you it was still there. So when the alert flashed in the lower edge of my NAV display, thin and amber and easy to ignore, I almost dismissed it on instinct. Almost. Then I looked at the frequency. Then I looked at the origin point. Then I sat a little straighter in my chair and read the line again, because the signal did not belong there. Not the band, not the pattern, not the source angle. None of it fit. It sat in my console feed like a wrong note in a military hymn, small enough that an untrained ear might have missed it, but once heard impossible to pretend away. I reached forward and pulled the feed onto the main display. Around me, the night rotation of the NAV deck remained exactly as it had been for the previous 9 hours. Quiet, dim, stable in the kind of way that made time feel theoretical. The overhead strips ran at 30% to preserve circadian discipline, washing the consoles in low white light. Auxiliary displays breathed softly in standby blue. The life support system hummed in the walls with the calm confidence of something that had done its job, so long it no longer needed praise for it. Beyond the forward viewport, there was only distance. No nearby stars. No traffic lanes. No station glow. No debris field catching light. Just the cold spread of far systems. So distant, they looked less like destinations and more like errors punched into black glass. My name is Commander Talia Vey. I am Chief Navigation Officer aboard the long-range patrol vessel Endurance, attached to the outer diplomatic survey arm of the Compact's human contingent, which is a long official way of saying I spend most of my life guiding a ship through places important people claim are strategically relevant and everyone else would correctly describe as empty. At 3:47 ship time, I had been on this patrol route for 14 months, 3 weeks and 2 days. That is long enough for a person to develop habits. Mine were mostly harmless. I cataloged maintenance sounds by section and severity without being asked. I counted course correction pulses in my head, even when the computer was doing it for me. And when the patrol got especially quiet, which it usually did around the 5th or 6th week between inhabited systems, I named dust signatures drifting through the outer sensor sweep. Not the dangerous kind, not metallic debris or ionized fragments, or anything with mass enough to matter, just the little almost nothings. Particles barely worth the system's attention, things too small to threaten a hull, and too persistent to be called imaginary. It had started 8 months into the route when I realized I was staring at the same lazy cluster for 23 minutes as if it had personally insulted me. The first one I named was Esther. By month 14, I was up to particle 409. Number 409 was just then moving along the upper right edge of the sweep, drifting with a faint northeast bias against the long-range wash. I had named her Mercy an hour earlier, because she had appeared during the end of a truly unforgivable meal in the mess, and any distraction from that tray had felt providential. Mercy drifted on, unconcerned. The signal pulsed again. I magnified it, checked for relay ghosting, bleed over, false reflection, background mimicry. Nothing. It held its shape. My fingers moved automatically across the console. Confirm source vector. Check passive array. Cross-reference with treaty-blocked bands. Compare signature against known civilian traffic, compact beacon standards, archival distress channels, dead military registries, abandoned probe frequencies. Every answer came back wrong in a slightly different way. The signal was real. That was the first problem. The second problem was that it was broadcasting in a band humanity was not officially supposed to be monitoring. I did not react outwardly to that realization, which is one of the reasons I still held the chair I held. A navigator who survives deep patrol learns very quickly that surprise is a private event. You can have it. You are even entitled to it, but you have it quietly and preferably after your hands have already done the work. My hands were steady. They always are. My mother used to say I inherited them from someone better at lying than she was, and she would say it in the same tone other mothers used for passing on cheekbones or stubbornness. I inherited the tone from her too, though I had more use for the hands. I routed the signal through the standard passive decoder. The decoder took 6 seconds to return a result. That is 5 seconds longer than it should take for ordinary traffic, and 6 seconds is an uncomfortable amount of time when you are staring at something the computer itself seems reluctant to understand. When the output finally appeared, it did not resolve into language. It resolved into structure, repeated intervals, burst spacing, packet hierarchy, handshaking logic. Not random, not natural, intended. I felt something cold and narrow settle just beneath my ribs. There are moments in patrol work when the universe gives you enough information to know a line has been crossed, but not enough to tell you what waits on the other side of it. This was one of those moments. I checked the command clock in the corner of my display. 3:48. Captain Wren was asleep, or pretending to be. Our executive officer was in scheduled rest cycle. Tactical was running skeleton watch in the compartment below me. Communications would be on reduced staffing until 4 o'clock. On a normal night, any of that might have mattered. This was no longer a normal night. I locked the signal into a private NAV partition and ran a deeper translation pass. While the system worked, I leaned back once in my chair and let my eyes move over the rest of the deck. Lieutenant Sarah Dane sat 2 stations to my left at stellar drift analysis, half lit by her console, and very possibly dreaming with her eyes open. She had mastered the art of looking alert while thinking about other things, which I respected more than I approved of. At Environmental Systems, Webb, too young for a route this quiet and too eager to admit it, was pretending not to monitor a sports feed under his diagnostics window. He had the specific expression of a man trying to look innocent in advance. All of it was ordinary. That made the signal worse, because catastrophe rarely announces itself by sounding like catastrophe at first. More often it arrives inside normality, sitting there patiently until someone notices the shape is wrong. The translator continued processing. Outside the viewport, the stars did not move. They never do from this distance. People imagine space as motion. They imagine streaking light and grand crossings, and the visual language of ships tearing through the dark. That is not what deep transit looks like from the inside. From the inside, if your engines are well balanced and your route is clean, the universe appears to have settled into a decision long before you arrived. Everything holds still. Everything keeps its secrets. You move through the dark, and the dark is under no obligation to acknowledge you. Mercy reached the edge of the sweep, vanished for a moment, then flickered back into range. I made a note to keep the name. My translator chimed. The text populated line by line. I read it once, then again, then a third time, not because I had failed to understand it, but because understanding it on the first pass felt structurally irresponsible. The message was short, shorter than a proper military burst, shorter than a standard diplomatic hail, stripped down past elegance into need, assistance required. Attached beneath it was a coordinate string. Below that, a source marker. I stared at the source marker until the letters stopped feeling like language and became what they actually were. An identifier, a civilization tag, a name, not human, not compact standard, old enough that I had only seen it in restricted archival briefings and historical threat assessments written by people trying very hard to sound calm. The Avar. I want to be precise about what that means, because names like that can slide past the ear if you have not lived in the part of the galaxy where they still carry weight. The Avar are not powerful in the way governments are powerful. They are powerful in the way old mountains are powerful, in the way dead stars are powerful, through scale, age, and the accumulated pressure of having remained where other things failed. Their records go back farther than most species myths can account for. Their cities are older than several allied civilizations. Their diplomacy, when they bother with it, has the tone of something extending courtesy to weather. They do not ask for help. That is not a dramatic statement. It is an administrative one. In every confirmed exchange on compact record, the Avar have offered warning, instruction, refusal, observation, correction, historical commentary, and on one memorable occasion, what several translators agreed was probably contempt. They have never once issued an open assistance request. Not to the compact, not to humanity, not to anyone. I checked the source marker again, hoping with a professionalism I am not proud of that I had misread some character in the stream. I had not. Assistance required. Avar source. Deep band transmission. Treaty-blocked spectrum. Real coordinates. My hands remained steady. That mattered to me. I enlarged the coordinate string and dropped it against our active long-range overlay. The map shifted, recalibrated, and painted the source vector in pale white against a region of space so underused it barely deserved the word region. No traffic lattice. No colony lane. No stable resource marker. No permanent compact platform. Just deep dark and a patch of bureaucratic neglect, so complete it had been labeled provisional border uncertainty, and then ignored for 12 years. I felt the back of my neck tighten, because the coordinates were not merely distant. They were positioned in the kind of place things choose, when they do not want company. I opened the signal again, and listened to its raw waveform through the audio emulator. Most non-human transmissions sound wrong when made audible. Too thin, too layered, too mathematically clean, too distorted by translation frameworks built by species who evolved with atmosphere and lungs and all the assumptions that come with them. This one came through as a broken pulse under static, clipped and repeating, almost rhythm, but not quite. Not fear, not panic, something worse. Control under pressure. A message sent by something accustomed to being obeyed, forced by circumstances into the indignity of asking. At 3:51, a secondary flag appeared at the far edge of my NAV screen. Then another, then 6 more. For one stupid half-second, I thought Mercy had split into a cluster. Then I realized what I was looking at. Transponder shadows. Cold signatures running dark beyond the primary sweep limit. I froze them, widened the field, and watched new returns bloom one after another across the edge of the map. Too clean for debris. Too coordinated for drift. Too numerous for accident. Ships. Human-built. If the mass profiles were telling the truth. No public identification. No open channels. No declared presence in a sector where, according to every route summary I had been handed before departure, no meaningful concentration of Allied fleet assets existed within weeks of our patrol track. I counted to 15 and stopped because the count had stopped being useful. The display lit with quiet markers, each one holding disciplined silence. Not lost, not scattered, waiting. That word arrived whole in my mind, and once there it refused to leave. I looked from the ghost signatures to the Avar transmission and back again. Then to the command clock. 3:52. I did not yet know what had found us in the dark. I did not know why the Avar had broken a silence older than some civilizations. I did not know why there were hidden human vessels sitting inside intercept range of a distress call no one was supposed to hear. But I knew, with the flat certainty that matters more than comfort, that 14 months of boredom had just ended all at once. I rose from the NAV chair, opened the secure line to the captain's quarters, and kept my eyes on the dark markers gathering at the edge of the map. When the channel began to ring, Mercy drifted back into sensor range as if nothing at all had changed. Captain Wren answered on the second tone. That was the first thing that told me this night had been waiting for someone other than me. Most captains on deep patrol do not answer secure channels on the second tone at 3:52 unless they are still awake, and most captains are not still awake at 3:52 unless they have a reason. Wren's face appeared on the inset in low quarters light, the angular planes of it half-shadowed, expression composed in that particular command way that always looks calm from the outside and expensive from the inside. "Commander," he said. I did not waste words. "I've got an unauthorized deep band signal on a treaty-blocked frequency of our source marker, direct assistance request, live coordinates, and at least 15 dark human signatures holding silent beyond our primary sweep." He looked at me for 1 second. Not surprise, not confusion, a calculation, the kind of stillness people reach when the thing they prepared themselves to hear finally arrives and turns out, by some private miracle, to sound exactly as bad as expected and no worse. "Patch everything to Command Partition 2, he said. "Do not broadcast. Externally. I'm on my way." The channel closed. I stood there with my hand still near the console and let that settle where it needed to settle. He had not asked if I was sure. He had not asked me to verify the source marker. He had not asked me to rerun the sweep or confirm the mass profiles or tell him whether the Avar message might be fraudulent. He had simply told me where to patch it. That is not how people respond to impossible things unless the impossible thing is already living somewhere in their expectation. I sat back down and did as ordered. Command Partition 2 was not part of the standard patrol workflow. I knew it existed in the way everyone aboard knew certain things existed. Sealed channels, emergency chains, buried authorizations, obscure routing options nested inside, system architecture built by cautious minds with long memories. Deep patrol is full of compartments like that. Most stay theoretical. The ship carries them the way a body carries old scars under clothing, present but not conversational. The partition opened on first authorization. That was the second thing that told me something about this route had never been what it claimed to be. I transferred the Avar burst, the raw waveform, the source vector, and the dark signatures. The system accepted the package and returned a priority tag I had never seen on any previous patrol communication. Contingency recognized. I read the words once and felt the deck remain perfectly level beneath my boots. Then I read them again to make sure the system had not substituted one impossible thing for another. Contingency recognized. There are moments when language itself stops being helpful, when the difference between what is happening and what should be happening grows so wide that words no longer bridge it cleanly. They just stand on one side and point. I saved the tag, widened the sweep again, and let the overlay build. The 15 silent signatures became 23, then 28. The field kept breathing outward as the sensor solution improved, painting shape after shape into existence at the fringe of detection, not clustered randomly, not drifting with current or residual vector. They were arranged in depth. Formation, loose enough to avoid pattern confirmation by shallow scan, tight enough that anyone who knew what to look for would recognize organization the moment the map had enough honesty to admit it. Human hull profiles, or close enough to human hull profiles to be worse. Several were too large for diplomatic craft. One, sitting farther back in the dark, carried a mass shadow that made no sense at all if our official patrol briefing had been accurate about the nearest fleet positions. I let out one slow breath and checked the coordinates from the Avar call again. The hidden formation sat almost exactly where a rapid intercept screen would want to sit if it had been placed there in advance by someone who knew what direction the emergency was going to come from. Not guessed. Known. Lieutenant Dane stirred 2 stations over and turned in her chair, noticing at last that my main display was no longer carrying ordinary drift telemetry. "Commander?" "Stay on your station," I said. The tone did what it was supposed to do. She straightened without argument. Webb looked up from environmental diagnostics with the sudden bright alertness of youth, discovering at last that boredom has been lying to it. "What's happening?" "Quiet," I said, and because they both knew me well enough by then, that was enough. The lift at the back of the deck opened less than 20 seconds later. Captain Wren stepped out wearing boots, uniform trousers, and an undershirt under an unsealed command jacket, which is about as close to visible urgency as he ever allowed himself. Behind him came Colonel Marasol, patrol liaison attached to Endurance by diplomatic courtesy and treated by most of the crew as one of those ambiguous senior figures best respected from a healthy distance. Her presence on the night deck at 3:53 told me more than either of their expressions did. Not because she was alarmed, because she wasn't. She crossed to my station, looked once at the display, and said, "How long ago?" "First pulse at 3:47. "And the source integrity?" "Real," I said. "I checked for reflection, ghosting, mimicry, false relay, packet contamination, translation drift. It holds." I expected questions. What I got instead was Wren exhaling once through his nose and Sol giving a very small nod, as if something had arrived precisely on schedule, and was therefore allowed the courtesy of not being discussed emotionally. "Patch me the raw stream," she said. I pushed it to her wrist console. She read it, then looked at the dark signatures fanned across my map. Her eyes moved once across the formation, counting without appearing to count. There is a specific kind of silence that belongs only to people who have just confirmed the existence of something they hoped never to need. She wore that silence for perhaps a second. Then she said, "Wake communications. Full secure staffing. No ship-wide alert." That last part landed strangely. No ship-wide alert. Any normal captain faced with a Forbidden of Our distress burst and a hidden human formation in deep black would at minimum want the crew at readiness. Wren gave the order without hesitation anyway, which meant both of them were now operating under instructions older than the moment. Webb glanced between us, trying to look useful and invisible at the same time. Dane had gone still in the way people do when discipline and curiosity are fighting to a draw. I kept my eyes on the display. "Captain," I said, "what exactly is Command Partition 2? Wren did not answer. Colonel Sol did. "It is the reason this route exists." I turned just enough to look at her directly. She was not a large woman, nor theatrically severe, nor blessed with any of the visual nonsense lesser minds like to project onto dangerous people. No scar crossing one eye, no ritual stillness, no sharpened smile. She looked, most days, like someone who could sit through 12 hours of budget meetings and emerge with the budget somehow afraid of her. But she had the calm of deeply buried steel, and at 3:54 that calm was the loudest thing on the deck. "The route," she continued. "The diplomatic shadow work, the dead sectors, the repetitive drift tracks, the outer mapping revisions, all of it was built to maintain proximity without announcing proximity." "To what?" Dane asked before she could stop herself. Sol looked at her, not unkindly, not kindly either, simply with the clean assessment of a person deciding whether another person had earned the next sentence. Then she looked back at my display. "To the possibility," she said, "that one day something old would finally ask." No one said anything for a moment after that. Some sentences close a room. That one did. I looked again at the Avar transmission and felt the scale of it change inside my head. Not because the words themselves were. Commerce. Too empty for argument. The kind of place the compact forgets on purpose because remembering everything would force it to admit how much it cannot control. As the new overlay settled, another layer lit beneath it. Approach vectors. Multiple. Already calculated. The dark signatures on my screen were not merely in position. They were slotted. Each hull shadow, each silent mass, each hidden asset had its place in a larger answer that existed before 347 and would have existed if the Avar call had arrived tonight, next week, or 5 years from now. I stared at the intercept geometry and understood all at once that this was not a response being assembled. This was a response being unlocked. That difference mattered more than almost anything else I had learned in my service. Because anyone can mobilize after disaster becomes undeniable. Only a civilization carrying old fear in disciplined hands builds the wall before the fire reaches it. I thought then of all the things humanity had been called by newer allies and older species alike: impatient, militarily imaginative, strategically irrational, too quick to assume danger, too fond of worst-case modeling, too willing to sink resources into scenarios polite societies preferred to keep hypothetical. There are many elegant ways to say paranoid when discussing humans in diplomatic rooms. At 3:57 ship time, watching hidden intercept screens blossom around a Navarre distress call no one in the public compact was supposed to hear, I found that I no longer considered the word an insult. Communications came online in full secure mode 30 seconds later. Status indicators flashed green across the side panel. Encrypted relay lanes opened. Silent routing channels established themselves one by one like doors unlocking down a long corridor. Sol keyed her console and spoke a single phrase into the channel. Reckoning confirmed. Nothing happened for 2 seconds. Then everything did. The far mass shadow that the system had refused to classify ignited its beacon. Not bright, not loud, no triumphant flood of signal, no announcement to the stars. Just one precise activation, clean and undeniable. Then a second ship lit, then 7 more. Then the whole black formation unfolded into identification with the solemn order of something ceasing to hide because the moment for hiding had expired. Hull tags streamed across my display. Human registry, human command architecture, human fleet designation, not diplomatic, not survey, not civilian, warships, real ones. A line of cold awareness moved through me, so sharply it almost felt like relief. Not because warships in the dark are comforting things, because uncertainty had finally lost ground to truth. There they were. All the quiet years made metal. All the denied budgets, buried corridors, disguised routes, sealed channels, and suspiciously patient patrols given shape and engine mass and command structure in the black beyond our bow. 34 signatures became 52 as the second layer of the formation revealed itself, then more beyond them. Farther out, holding silent depth. I stopped counting, not because the numbers ceased to matter, because the scale had crossed into a different category of meaning. Webb was openly staring now, youth and awe-stripping pretense from his face. Dane had one hand over her mouth, not in fear, but in the involuntary gesture of a mind trying to contain the first rough edge of a realization too large to carry elegantly. Captain Wren watched the beacon activations with the expression of a man seeing old mathematics prove itself. Colonel Sol did not smile, but something in her posture altered by half a degree, as if a burden had shifted from waiting to use. The Avar signal pulsed again in the corner of my display. Assistance required. No embellishment, no panic, no rhetorical plea, just the raw dignity of necessity. And now, across the dark around that call, humanity was answering in the only language deep space had ever truly respected. Preparation. I looked at the hidden fleet, made visible and understood, with a clarity that left no room for comfort, that the galaxy beyond our patrol lanes was about to learn something it had spent decades assuming was only a human flaw. We had not feared too much. We had simply believed the dark would eventually become specific. On my outer sweep, the particle I had named Mercy drifted once more across the sensor fringe, tiny and directionless, and entirely unbothered by the fact that history had just changed shape around her. Then the secure command feed opened, and a voice I did not recognize said the words that turned suspicion into certainty. All stations, all reckoning elements, this is Fleet Actual. The line is active. The first thing I noticed after the fleet lit its beacons was not the number of ships. It was how clean the silence became. Before, the dark around us had felt empty in the way empty places usually do. Wide, indifferent, uninterested in being known. After the activation, that same dark felt occupied, not crowded, held. The difference is subtle until you feel it. Then it becomes impossible to mistake. My display stabilized as the final identifiers resolved into a complete structure. Layers within layers. Outer screens, midline anchors, inner command clusters. It was not just a fleet. It was a design that assumed something large would eventually come through that region of space and require stopping, not deterring, not negotiating. Stopping. I leaned forward slightly, fingers resting just above the console without touching it. Those positions, I said quietly, they weren't chosen after the signal. Captain Wren didn't look at me. No. Colonel Soul's voice followed, calm and precise. They were chosen years ago. Years. The words settled into the same place the others had gone. Already. Contingency. Reckoning. I pulled the overlay wider, digging deeper into the data ribbon that had opened under Command Partition 2. Now that the protocol had activated, the system was less reluctant to show me things. Not everything, but enough. Supply routes appeared first. At a glance, they looked like exactly what I had always believed them to be. Low-priority freight corridors, survey loops, long-haul maintenance tracks moving equipment between underused stations. I recognized some of them. I had flown parallel to 2 of those paths during month 6 of the patrol, irritated at the time by how inefficient they seemed on paper. They were not inefficient. They were redundant, layered, each corridor feeding into hidden staging points that, when viewed in isolation, appeared pointless. When viewed together, they formed a web centered on the exact region, now carrying an Avar distress call. I felt something shift in my understanding of the last 14 months. Every long, quiet transit, every unnecessary deviation, every routine recalibration that had added hours to our route for no clear reason, every instruction not to question the shape of the patrol path. None of it had been random. None of it had been filler. It had all been proximity management, keeping us close enough to respond, far enough not to be noticed. I scrolled further. Maintenance logs, docking records, civilian registry chains. On the surface, they were ordinary. Survey vessels reporting structural checks, generational ships, rotating crew, freight carriers logging extended stops in outer systems. But now, with the formation lit and the contingency active, the patterns aligned. Those ships had not been idle. They had been storing parts, fuel, munitions, spare systems, quietly feeding the skeleton of something no one outside a very narrow circle was supposed to see as a whole. I exhaled slowly. Everything we classified as low-value traffic, I said, was feeding this. Yes, said Soul. There was no pride in it. No apology either. Just fact. Webb shook his head once, almost involuntarily. That's decades of work. 31 years, Soul said. Dane turned to her. You built this for 31 years. Soul looked at the formation on my display. We built options, she said. This is one of them. Options. Another clean word. Another heavy one. I understood, then something that had been sitting just out of reach since the moment the command partition opened. This fleet was not an emergency response. It was not even a contingency in the reactive sense. It was a conclusion, a decision made long ago that if a certain category of threat ever became real, humanity would not wait to agree on what to do about it. We would already have done the work. That I felt my hands rest more firmly on the console. Steady. They always are. Captain, I said, how many more formations like this exist? Ren's eyes flicked to Sol. Sol did not hesitate. Enough, she said. Not a number. A boundary. I did not push further. Some answers are not given because they are not meant to be carried casually. The secure channel pulsed again. A new layer of data streamed into the command partition, tagged from Fleet Command, live telemetry from the outer screen, velocity vectors, shield status, power distribution, all of it organized, precise, already aligned with the intercept geometry I had just been studying. I followed one of the approach lines with my eyes. It intersected the Avar coordinates in 11 hours. 11 hours. The number settled into place like a weight you measure rather than feel. Long enough to think. Short enough that thinking had to be useful. Dane saw it at the same time I did. They're not accelerating. No, I said. The fleet was moving, but not rushing. Every vector adjustment was controlled, deliberate, almost patient, like something that had rehearsed this exact movement enough times that speed was no longer necessary. Webb leaned forward. If that's an intercept course, shouldn't they be pushing harder? Sol answered him. They're already where they need to be. He blinked. That doesn't make sense. It does, I said, before she could continue. If the formation was placed in advance, the intercept isn't a reaction. It's a closing motion. I watched the vectors again. They were not racing to meet the threat. They were tightening around it. That was the moment the scale shifted again. Not just preparation. Positioning. Humanity had not simply built a fleet. Humanity had placed that fleet in the dark, in the exact place something dangerous would eventually have to pass through. Not because we knew what the threat would be, because we believed something would come, and we intended to be standing there when it did. The Avar signal pulsed again, weaker this time. Assistance required. I felt a strange, almost unwelcome sense of alignment move through me. Not satisfaction, not relief. Recognition, as if two separate truths, human preparation and Avar need, had been moving toward each other for a very long time and had finally intersected. Sol watched the signal for a moment, then turned slightly toward Ren. Patch the burst to Fleet Command. It's already in the partition, he said. I want it acknowledged. There was a difference. I understood it. Receiving a call is passive. Answering it is a decision. Ren nodded once. Do it. I routed the transmission through the command layer, attaching full verification, source integrity confirmation, and coordinate lock. For a second, nothing happened. Then the system returned a simple confirmation. Received. No elaboration. No commentary. No hesitation. Received. The word carried more weight than most declarations, because it meant the fleet had not just been waiting. It had been waiting for this. Webb let out a breath. He didn't try to hide this time. So what happens now? I didn't answer immediately, because the answer was visible. It was already unfolding across my display. The outermost ships shifted their positions by fractions of degrees, tightening the intercept geometry. Inner formations adjusted power distribution, shields rising not in dramatic flare, but in quiet readiness. Communication channels between vessels opened and stabilized, a web of intent connecting hull to hull without wasted motion. No chaos, no rush, no confusion, just execution. Sol spoke, almost to herself. This is what it looks like when the question has already been answered. Dane looked at her. What question? Sol didn't look away from the screen. What do we do when something comes that won't stop? Silence followed. Not empty silence. Full silence. The kind that carries understanding whether you want it or not. I thought about the years inside that data ribbon. 31 years of building. 31 years of hiding. 31 years of being quietly dismissed in council rooms as overly cautious, overly aggressive, overly human. And all of it had been leading to this moment. Not to prove a point. To meet a reality. The fleet continued its slow, inevitable closing motion. 11 hours. The number remained steady. Outside the viewport, the stars still did not move. They never do. But on the display, in the dark we had spent decades preparing for, something was finally happening that the stars had no say in. I glanced at the edge of the sensor sweep. The particle I had named Mercy drifted out of range again, slipping past the boundary as if nothing of importance had changed. For a brief second, I considered naming the next one. Then I stopped, not because the habit had lost its value, because the moment had outgrown it. I returned my full attention to the formation, to the intercept lines, to the quiet certainty of human ships moving exactly where they had always intended to move. And for the first time since 347, I understood the shape of the truth clearly enough to name it. We had not been waiting for orders. We had been waiting for permission. The Avar had just given it. The council chamber was already in session when the first fleet identifiers went public. Not officially, not declared. But there is a moment in every large system when information outruns permission, when data leaks sideways through channels that were never meant to carry it, and everyone in the room realizes at the same time that something has changed shape beyond the reach of procedure. I was present via long-range holo, my image anchored at the far end of the chamber table, slightly desaturated at the edges the way all projections are, as if the system itself refuses to fully commit to your presence. It was 6:02, 3 hours and 15 minutes after the signal. 3 hours and 15 minutes since 14 months of silence had ended. The chamber was full. Delegates from 12 compact species, some physically present, others projected like me, arranged in the careful geometry of negotiated hierarchy. Translators ran in quiet layers across the ceiling lattice. Data feeds hovered in controlled transparency above the table, each one carrying a piece of the same unfolding truth. At the center of it all, the Avar distress burst looped in soft repetition. Assistance required. No embellishment. No urgency in tone. Just the weight of the request. I kept my primary attention on the council. My secondary screen, angled just out of holocapture range, carried the fleet. They were still moving. Still tightening. Still patient. No one in the chamber knew that yet. Not fully. That was about to change. A Den intelligence officer named Vel Orano stood at the briefing axis, her posture composed, her voice measured in that precise, economical cadence her species favored when delivering information that could not be softened by tone. The signal has been verified across 5 independent relay chains, she said. Source integrity confirmed. The origin matches known of our communication architecture at a confidence threshold exceeding 99%. A ripple moved through the chamber, not loud, not chaotic, the kind of controlled disturbance that happens when a room full of very important people realizes something has entered the conversation that none of them have a prepared position for. An Irati delegate, Kale, centuries old by his species measure, voice calm in the way only very old things achieve, leaned forward slightly. The Avar do not issue assistance requests. It was not a question. Vel Orano inclined her head. They do not. And yet they have. Yes. Silence followed, the kind that builds rather than empties. I watched faces, different physiologies, different expressions, different ways of processing shock. But the pattern was the same. Recalculation. Fast. Careful. Incomplete. No one in that room had lived in a galaxy where the Avar asked for help, which meant no one in that room knew what the rules were anymore. Velorano continued. The coordinates attached to the signal place the source within a region designated as unclaimed deep territory. Historical survey data indicates minimal activity, low resource value, and no permanent installations. That part was technically true. It was also now meaningless, because minimal activity does not survive contact with a hidden fleet. A younger Den delegate spoke next, her tone controlled but edged with something sharper beneath it. What is the projected response time for a coordinated compact mobilization? Velorano did not hesitate. 43 days under optimal conditions, assuming full commitment from all member species. A murmur passed through the chamber. 43 days. I glanced at my secondary screen. 10 hours and 47 minutes. The difference between those numbers sat in my chest like a quiet, undeniable truth. Kale spoke again. And the Avar do not have 43 days. No, said Velorano. The room understood that. They understood it the way people understand falling once the ground has already begun to move toward them. At 6:19, the first anomaly report came through. It arrived as a side-channel flag, routed through a communications officer who had not yet decided whether what they were seeing was a malfunction or a problem. Unidentified vessel clusters, the officer said, voice uncertain. Multiple sectors. No response to standard hails. Transponder signatures inconsistent with registry records. Orano turned slightly. Clarify inconsistent. They are broadcasting identification codes, the officer said, but the codes correspond to civilian classifications that do not match observed mass and configuration. That was the moment, the exact point where the truth began to surface. I watched it happen in real time. Delegates leaned forward. Data feeds shifted. Attention sharpened. The room began to pivot. Orano's voice remained steady. Project the data. The central display adjusted. At first, it showed exactly what the officer had described. Civilian designations, freight vessels, survey craft, long-range habitation ships, the kind of infrastructure every species in the compact relied on. Then the system applied visual overlay, mass readings corrected, power signatures recalibrated, structural analysis updated, and the ships changed, not visually, conceptually, the same hulls, the same shapes, the same registry codes, but now seen for what they actually were. Not civilian, not harmless, not what anyone had assumed. The room went very quiet. I did not speak. Not yet. This part mattered. They needed to see it themselves, to arrive at it without being told, because realization is always more powerful than explanation. Kale's gaze shifted slowly across the display. These are human vessels, he said. Yes, said Velorano. They are not configured for civilian use. No, they are positioned across multiple sectors. Yes. Another silence. He turned his attention to my projection. There are expressions that do not translate cleanly across species. What he wore then was one of them. Not anger, not fear. Something closer to the moment. A structure you have trusted for a very long time reveals a hidden layer you were never meant to see. Commander Vey, he said, would you care to explain what we are looking at? The room turned to me. Every eye, every sensor, every interpretation system. Waiting. This was the point where lesser answers would collapse, where evasion would break, where deflection would confirm the worst assumptions in the room. So I did not evade. I did not deflect. I told them enough. They are not civilian vessels, I said. That part was easy. They are not newly deployed, I continued. Harder. They have been in position for years. That was where the room shifted. Physically, subtly, but unmistakably. Years. The word moved through them like a pressure change. The younger Den delegate spoke again. You are saying humanity has deployed military assets across unclaimed deep space without declaration? Yes. No hesitation. No softening. No diplomatic cushioning. Because anything less would have sounded like fear. And fear, right then, would have been the worst possible answer. Cale held my gaze. For what purpose? That was the real question. Not legal. Not procedural. Not political. Purpose. I glanced once at my secondary screen. The fleet was still moving. Still steady. Still precise. 10 hours and 39 minutes. Then I looked back at the council, and I gave them the truth in the only form that mattered. We knew something would come, I said. Not data, not proof, not specifics. Something. The room absorbed that. Slowly, carefully, as if turning it too quickly might break it. Vel Orano spoke, her voice quieter now. There is no confirmed intelligence supporting an imminent large-scale threat prior to this signal. I nodded. That's correct. Then on what basis did humanity justify this deployment? There it was. The line every other species had been walking for decades. The line between caution and paranoia, between preparation and provocation, between what is known and what is felt. I chose my words carefully. Not in secret, I said. In plain sight. That drew attention. Good. We classified them as freight, I continued, as survey missions, as generational habitation vessels. All of which they are, I added, because that part mattered. A ship can be more than one thing. A choice can be more than one thing. Cale watched me, and beneath that classification, I held his gaze. Preparation. No elaboration. No apology. Just the word. The room understood. Not all at once, but enough. I saw it in the way their attention shifted. From accusation, to comprehension, to something else. Something heavier. The younger delegate leaned forward. You built a fleet, she said, on the assumption of a threat you could not define. Yes, and you did so without compact consensus. Yes, and you positioned it across deep space, in advance of any confirmed event. Yes. Each answer landed clean, uncomplicated, unavoidable. She sat back slightly, processing, recalculating, reframing, because the question she had been asking was no longer the right one. That happens sometimes. When reality shifts, the question stops being, why did you do this? And becomes, what did you see that we didn't? At 6:31, the chamber lights dimmed slightly as a new transmission forced priority. A visual feed, fragmented, damaged, but intact enough. Vel Orano turned. Source. A VAR relay station, the comm officer said. Display it. The image filled the center of the chamber. Debris. Not random. Not natural. Structured destruction. The remains of something built with intention. And moving through it, a formation. Large. Organized. Unstoppable in the way things become when they no longer recognize resistance as a meaningful variable. The Wreath Collective. The room did not know the name yet, but they knew what they were seeing. The translator worked. Slowly, carefully, parsing symbols on the hulls. Markings. Codes. Language. I watched the council, not the screen, because the screen would tell them what the ships were. Their faces would tell me when they understood what that meant. The translator finished. English. Military-grade hull identification. Human. The chamber did not react loudly. It did not erupt. It did not panic. It simply stopped. Every conversation, every assumption, every carefully constructed boundary around what humanity was allowed to be, stopped. Cale looked at me again. This time, there was no ambiguity in his expression. You deployed them in advance, he said. Yes. You knew this was coming. No, I said. That mattered. That distinction mattered more than almost anything else. We knew something would come. I repeated. The difference is small, but it changes everything. Because knowing something will come is not prophecy. It is recognition. Cale held that for a moment. Then he asked the question that had been building in the room since the first civilian registry cracked open. How many ships? I looked at my secondary screen. The formation had fully resolved now. Not just the outer layer. All of it. Every hidden line. Every silent hull. Every piece of the answer humanity had been building in the dark. I gave him the number and watched the galaxy understand, all at once, that humanity had never been as unprepared as it had appeared. Not even close. 11 hours became 10. 10 became 9. Time did not accelerate. It did not slow. It simply became visible. That is the difference. When nothing is happening, time is background. It moves without weight, without friction, without consequence. You notice it only when it has already passed. When something is coming, time gains edges. You can feel it moving. I sat at the NAV console, with both displays active, the council chamber still open on one side, the fleet overlay on the other. I did not shift between them anymore. I held both at once. That was the requirement now. To understand two things simultaneously. What was happening, and what it meant. The fleet continued its motion. No change in urgency. No increase in speed. No deviation from the pattern it had already committed to. That steadiness did more to quiet the mind than any reassurance could have, because panic spreads through unpredictability. This was not unpredictable. This was decided. Captain Wren had not left the deck. Colonel Soul had not moved from her position beside my station. Neither of them spoke unless necessary. There is a kind of discipline that emerges only in moments like this. Not enforced, not announced, just adopted. Every movement becomes intentional. Every word carries weight. Every silence is allowed to exist without being filled. Webb had stopped trying to ask questions. Dane had stopped trying to look calm. Both of them watched the display with the same expression now. Not fear. Attention. That was enough. On the council feed, the room had changed. The initial shock had burned off. The noise had settled. What remained was denser, more focused. The kind of quiet that comes when a group of intelligent beings realizes that the conversation they prepared for is no longer the one they are having. Vel Orano stood at the center, her voice still precise, still controlled. The Wreath Collective continues its advance at a constant velocity, she said. No deviation, no communication, no observable response to Avar distress signaling. The image behind her showed the same movement we had been watching for hours. The Wreath did not surge. They did not hesitate. They did not adapt in any visible way. They moved. That was all. But it was enough. Because consistency is its own kind of threat. Speed can be countered. Aggression can be redirected. Consistency means something does not need to change. It is already sufficient. Kale spoke again, his voice carrying the same measured weight it had held since the beginning. And the human fleet. Vel Orano paused for half a second. That was new. Not hesitation. Consideration. They are holding formation, she said. The chamber absorbed that. Holding. Not advancing aggressively. Not retreating. Not dispersing. Holding. I watched the fleet overlay as she said it. It was true. The outer line had reached its intercept geometry. The inner formations had a line behind it. No further compression. No unnecessary movement. They had arrived, and they were staying exactly where they needed to be. 9 hours. The number sat in the corner of my mind like a quiet calculation that no longer required conscious attention. The younger Den delegate leaned forward. If the collective does not stop, she said, what is the human response? The question landed clean, direct, necessary. All eyes shifted again. To me, I did not answer immediately. Not because I did not know, because the answer was not mine to give yet. I watched the fleet, watched the line they had formed, watched the way it held. Not rigid, not brittle, flexible within limits, stable under pressure. A boundary. Colonel Soul spoke. Before I did. They will not pursue. The room turned to her. That was the first time she had spoken directly into the council feed. Her presence had been noted before. Now it was acknowledged. Kale inclined his head slightly. "Colonel." She did not return the gesture. "The objective is containment," she continued, "not escalation." A murmur moved through the chamber. Containment. The word carried implications. Limits. Restraint. Control. The younger delegate frowned slightly. If the collective represents an existential threat, why not eliminate it while the opportunity exists? Soul's answer came without pause. Because we do not know the full scope of the system we are engaging. Silence. She let that sit, then added, and because escalation without understanding creates problems larger than the one you are trying to solve. That was not theory. That was experience. I recognized it immediately. So did Kale. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in recognition of something familiar. "You have encountered this before," he said. Soul did not answer directly. "We have prepared for it," she said. "Not the same thing, but close enough. On my display." The wreath continued its advance. The distance closed. Not dramatically, not in a way that would satisfy someone looking for action, but steadily. I tracked the leading edge, watched it approach the outer line. 8 hours. Webb shifted slightly beside his station. "Commander," he said quietly, "what happens if they don't stop?" I did not look at him. "They will," I said. Confidence, not hope, not belief. Statement. He nodded once, not because he fully understood, because the tone carried more weight than the words. On the council feed, a new question surfaced. This one from an Irati aide behind Kale, voice softer, less practiced. "Commander Vey," she said, "were you afraid?" The question landed differently, not strategic, not political, personal. I felt it register in a part of me that had been quiet until then. 17 months. Dust particles. Empty sectors. The slow erosion of novelty into routine. The assumption that if something were going to happen, it would have happened already. And then, 3:47. The signal. The word already. The fleet in the dark. The realization that nothing had been as empty as it looked. "Yes," I said. No hesitation. The room held that. Not as weakness, as truth. Kale watched me. "Are you afraid now?" he asked. I considered it. Not quickly, because quick answers to questions like that are usually wrong. I looked at the fleet, at the line they held, at the way it did not move, at the way it did not need to move, at the way it had been placed there long before I understood why. Then I looked back at the council. "No," I said. The difference between those two answers mattered. It mattered more than most of what had been said in that room, because fear is not the problem. Uncontrolled fear is. Humanity had felt the first, and turned it into the second thing. Preparation. 7 hours. The wreath approached the outer boundary. No change in velocity. No signal. No acknowledgement. Just movement. The fleet did not react. Not visibly. No weapon systems lit. No shields flared. No dramatic shift in posture. They remained exactly what they had been since the moment they revealed themselves. A line. I watched the distance close. Watched the gap shrink to something measurable in seconds rather than hours. Watched the point where two decisions made in different times were about to meet. The council chamber went quiet. Not instructed. Not enforced. Just quiet. Every delegate understood what was coming. Not the outcome, but the moment. That is enough. 5 hours. 4. 3. The numbers passed without announcement, without ceremony. Time continued its steady movement, but now everyone could feel it. At 2 hours, the wreath entered long-range engagement distance. The fleet still did not move, not forward, not back. Holding. Webb whispered something under his breath. I did not catch it. It did not matter. At 1 hour, I became aware of my own breathing. Not fast. Not slow. just present, like the stars, like the line, like the moment itself. 30 minutes. The wreath crossed into the outer sensor resolution of the fleet. Shapes became clearer, patterns more defined. Still no communication. Still no change. 15 minutes. 10. 5. The distance between them became something the mind could hold without abstraction. A space that could be crossed. A boundary that could be tested. 1 minute. I did not look at the council. I did not look at Webb or Dane or Wren or Sol. I watched the line, and the thing approaching it. The final seconds did not feel dramatic. They did not stretch. They did not compress. They simply arrived. The wreath reached the boundary, and for the first time since the signal, at 3:47, something changed. The change was not loud. It did not arrive with weapons fire or alarms, or the kind of visual spectacle lesser minds expect from moments like this. It arrived as a deviation, small, precise, impossible. The wreath slowed, not gradually, not as the result of visible resistance. They simply stopped accelerating. The advance that had held perfect consistency across every sensor reading, every projection, every model the Council had run in quiet desperation over the last hours, broke pattern. I felt it before I consciously registered it. A shift in the data stream, a break in the line. I leaned forward, eyes narrowing slightly as the telemetry updated. Velocity dropped, fractionally at first, then more. Not a halt, not yet, but no longer inevitable. The council chamber exhaled as a single organism, not relief, recognition. Something that had never happened before was happening now. The wreath did not stop. They adjusted. That distinction mattered, because stopping implies interruption. Adjustment implies decision. Vel Orano's voice cut through the silence. Collective advance rate has decreased by 12%. Her tone was unchanged, but the room heard it. 12%. It might as well have been everything. I watched the fleet, still holding, still unmoving. No forward push, no attempt to capitalize, no visible escalation, just presence, a boundary that did not negotiate. The wreath slowed further. 20%, 30%. The formation began to shift. Not disorder, not collapse, reconfiguration. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not fear, expectation. Because this was the moment the entire structure of human preparation had been built for. Not the fight, the decision. Would the wreath continue forward into resistance they did not understand? Or would they recognize something they had not encountered before? The answer came without announcement. The leading edge of the collective altered course. Not sharply, not dramatically. A slight vector change. Barely perceptible if you were not looking for it. But once seen, unmistakable. They were not advancing anymore. They were pulling back. Webb made a sound, not a word. Something between disbelief and awe. Dane's hand dropped from her console. Captain Wren did not move. Colonel Sol did not speak. I watched the data confirm what the eye had already understood. The wreath was retreating, not fleeing, not breaking, receding, reforming their line at a new distance, a boundary they had chosen, or been forced to accept. The council chamber broke, not in chaos, in sound, voices overlapping, questions forming before answers could exist. The kind of controlled disorder that happens when something impossible forces itself into reality and demands to be processed all at once. Vel Orano raised her hand slightly. The noise diminished. Not gone, but contained. Confirming, she said. The collective is withdrawing to previous positional markers. No evidence of pursuit by human fleet. No additional engagement. No pursuit. That part landed just as hard, because it answered the question before it was asked. The younger Den delegate spoke, her voice tighter now. They're retreating and humanity is not advancing? Yes, said Vel Orano. Why? Silence. Not because there was no answer, because the answer had not yet been spoken aloud. I looked at my console. A new message had arrived. Fleet command. Priority override. 3 words. I read them once. Then again. Then I understood why the fleet had not moved. Why it would not move. Why this moment had unfolded exactly as it had. I spoke into the chamber. They have standing orders. Every eye turned to me again. Kale leaned forward slightly. What orders? I did not look away from the message, because it did not need interpretation. It did not need explanation. It was already complete. Hold the line. The words settled into the room. Simple, unadorned, immovable. Not attack, not pursue, not eliminate. Hold the line. Kale repeated it quietly. Hold the line. Not as a question, as a realization. I nodded. For whom? He asked. The question was not rhetorical. It mattered, because the answer defined everything that had just happened. I looked at the fleet, at the boundary they had created, at the space between them and the wreath, at the distance that had not existed before this moment. Then I looked back at the council. For everyone, I said. The room went still. Not silent. Still, because that answer changed the shape of the event. This was not a victory. Not in the way most species defined victory. No territory taken. No enemy destroyed. No advantage pressed. Just a line drawn and held. Vel Orano spoke again, more quietly now. The collective has never retreated from a boundary once established. No one responded, because the implication was already clear. Until now, I watched the wreath stabilize at their new distance, reforming, reorganizing, not defeated, not gone, but stopped. That was enough. More than enough. Webb leaned forward again, unable to stop himself this time. They could push, he said. If they regroup, if they test the line again. They won't, I said. He looked at me. Why? I held his gaze for a second. Then I looked back at the display. Because this is the first time they've encountered something that doesn't break. Not resistance, not opposition, not conflict. A boundary, something that did not yield, did not escalate, did not collapse, just remained. The council began to shift again, not back to noise, to thought, real thought, heavy, deliberate, reframing everything they believed about the situation, about the wreath, about humanity. The younger delegate sat back slowly. You built all of this, she said. For a moment you couldn't define. Yes, I said, and you used it to stop, not to conquer. Yes, she processed that, slowly, carefully, because it did not fit the model she had been using. It did not fit any of their models. Kale spoke again, his voice carrying something new now. Respect. Restraint, he said, not weakness. I nodded once. Discipline. He held that, then inclined his head slightly, a gesture not native to his species. Learned, earned. The wreath remained at the boundary. The fleet remained at the line. Neither moved, neither advanced, neither escalated. The space between them held. A gap, a possibility, a choice that had already been made. The chamber settled into a different kind of quiet, not tension, not fear, understanding, because everyone in that room now knew what they had just witnessed. Not just a confrontation, not just a response, a statement, clear, unmistakable. Humanity had not come to win. Humanity had come to prevent loss. I leaned back slightly in my chair. My hands rested on the console. Steady. They always are. Outside the viewport, the stars remained exactly as they had been. Unmoved, unconcerned. But in the dark beyond them, in the space no one had been watching closely enough until now, something had been drawn, and, for the first time in a very long time, it held. There was no ceremony. That is the first thing to understand about what came after. No gathering of delegates beneath shared banners. No formal declaration echoing across the relay networks. No moment where anyone stood and said, in clear language, this is what we have just witnessed, and this is what it means. What there was instead looked smaller, quieter, more complicated, and far more permanent. The fleet did not advance. The wreath did not test the boundary again. They held their distance. Human vessels held theirs. The space between them remained exactly what it had become in that first impossible moment. A line. On the council feed, the conversation did not end. It changed shape. Arguments that had been prepared dissolved mid-sentence. Positions built over decades found themselves without ground to stand on. Legal frameworks, carefully negotiated and revised across generations, encountered something they had not been designed to contain. Humanity had not violated the rules. Humanity had built something the rules had never considered. The difference mattered, and no one in that chamber could ignore it. I stayed on the hollow link as long as I was needed, answering what I could, refusing what I could not. There is a discipline in saying, I don't know that most people in rooms like that never fully learn. It requires you to value accuracy over influence. It requires you to accept that uncertainty, when handled correctly, is stronger than a confident lie. Kale understood that. He asked fewer questions than the others, better ones. At one point, several hours after the line had been drawn and held, he leaned forward slightly and spoke not to the room, but to me. You said you were afraid. Yes. And now you are not. No. He studied me for a moment, not judging, measuring. Why? The question was simple. The answer was not. I did not rush it, because rushing answers to questions like that is a way of avoiding them. I looked at my secondary screen. The fleet still held. The wreath still waited. The distance between them remained unchanged. Then I looked back at him. Because we already did the part that should have frightened us, I said. He held that, then inclined his head once slowly, understanding. The chamber moved on. Discussions of response timelines gave way to discussions of integration. Sanctions were raised, examined, and quietly set aside without formal dismissal. No one needed to say it out loud. Punishing the only force that had successfully stopped the advance was not a position anyone could defend without breaking something larger than protocol. The legal language would come later. It always does. Long documents, careful phrasing, sections rewritten until they no longer threatened the balance they were meant to preserve. But the truth of it had already settled. Humanity had acted, not impulsively, not recklessly, deliberately, and the result now sat in the dark for anyone willing to look. The Avar did not speak again immediately. That, too, was expected. They had asked. They had been answered. For a civilization like theirs, that exchange was already enormous. When their next transmission came, it did not go to the council. It came directly to my console, personal channel, the same way the first had. I accepted it without hesitation. The translation took longer this time. Avar communication is layered. Meaning sits beneath meaning, beneath context, beneath something that is not quite language, but still carries intent. The systems do their best. They never quite finish the job. What came through was incomplete, but clear enough. We knew you would come. I read it once. Then again. Then I sat with it. Because sentences like that do not end when you reach the last word. They open into something deeper. I did not respond. Not because I had nothing to say. Because the message was complete without me. Some communications are not exchanges. They are acknowledgments. The council session stretched on, then fractured, then reformed into smaller conversations, working groups, quiet negotiations carried through secure channels that would never appear in public record. That is how large changes actually happen. Not in moments, in hours. In the work that follows, I disconnected from the hollow at 1900 hours ship time. The deck felt different without the constant presence of the chamber. Quieter, simpler, real. Webb sat across from me in the mess hall later, a cup of something approximating coffee cooling in his hands. He had been silent for several minutes. That was unusual. Finally, he looked up. "Did you know?" he asked. "Before the signal, before all of it, did you know what we had out there?" I thought about 347, about Mercy drifting along the edge of the sweep, about the word already, settling into the space between me and the truth before I understood what it meant, about the fleet, waiting in the dark, about the line, drawn long before it was needed. I knew something was out there. I said. He waited. He was learning that waiting mattered. Both kinds. I added. He processed that, slowly, then nodded once and looked back down at his cup. No follow-up question. Good instincts. I returned to the NAV deck alone. The displays were still active, still carrying the same image. The fleet, the wreath, the space between them, unchanged, unmoving, held. On the outer edge of the sensor sweep, a new particle drifted into range. Small, directionless, unimportant, the kind of thing I would have named without thinking a day ago. I watched it for a moment, then opened the log. My fingers hovered over the input. Steady. They always are. For a second, I considered leaving it blank, letting the habit end, letting this moment stand separate from everything that came before. Then I thought about what that would mean, and decided against it, because continuity matters, because small things matter, because the act of naming is not about the object. It is about the person doing it. I entered the designation. Reckoning. The particle drifted along the boundary of the sweep, moving in and out of range, never fully leaving, never fully entering. Present, persistent, like the line. I closed the log and leaned back in the chair. Outside the viewport, the stars had not moved. They never do. But in the deep, in the space everyone had assumed was empty enough to ignore, something had always been there. Not the fleet, not the wreath. Something older than both. An understanding that the dark is not empty. That waiting does not make it safer. That preparation is not paranoia. It is recognition. The fleet held. It always had. We had simply not been looking in the right way to see it. The final of our message arrived 4 days later. Short. Simpler than the first. Simpler than the second. For words. You were always here. I read it once. Then again. Then I saved it to my personal archive. Not the ship logs. Not the council records. Mine. Because some things belong to the person who understands them first. I did not try to define what they meant. Location, time, presence. All of those were possibilities. None of them were sufficient. I let the sentence remain what it was. Open. On the next patrol rotation. Webb took the secondary station. 6 hours into the transit, he leaned over slightly. If you name them, he said, nodding toward the sensor sweep, can I suggest one? I looked at him. One per watch, I said. You justify it. He thought about that, took it seriously. Good. A particle drifted into range along the upper edge of the sweep. He watched it for a while, longer than necessary, then nodded once. Patience, he said. Why? Because it stays, he answered, even when it looks like it's gone. I considered that, then entered the name. The dark outside remained unchanged. The same dark it had always been. The same dark that had existed before the compact, before contact, before anyone had started asking the questions that led to fleets and lines and the quiet decisions that shape everything that follows. Out there, beyond the range of most systems, beyond the reach of most conversations, beyond the assumptions of most species, the line still held. It would continue to hold, not because it had to, because it had been decided, long before anyone else understood the question. And now, everyone did.